Good evening. At this time, we'd like to call to order the Finance Committee meeting for the City Council of Palo Alto for Tuesday, December 5th, 2023. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Chair Burt,
Here.
Vice Mayor Stone,
Here.
Councilmember Lifcott Haynes.
Here.
For the record, we have 3 present. Thank you.
Thank you. So before proceeding to our 2 agendized items tonight, which are the long-range financial forecast and the 2023 committee referral status, we have an opportunity for members of the public to speak on any item not on the agenda, but which is within the purview of this committee. So do we have any members who wish to speak?
Chair, we have no request to speak.
All right, so we'll proceed to item number 1, which is a review and a recommendation to that the committee would make to the City Council that they accept the 2025 fiscal year to 2034 long-range financial forecast and the financial fiscal year 2025 annual budget development guidelines. So
I think you're looking at me.
Okay.
Good evening, Chair Burt and Finance Committee. I'm Paul Harper, Budget Manager with the Office of Management and Budget. I'm here along with my fellow Budget Manager, Jesse Deschamps, on Zoom, and the other members of the OMB team who are behind me. Tonight we'll be discussing the fiscal year 2025 through 2034 General Fund Long Range Financial Forecast. This also marks the start of the annual budget process for the development of the fiscal year 2025 budget. Next slide, please. So overall, the economy has remained resilient over the past few quarters, as the previously projected recession never actually materialized. However, inflation has continued to remain high. Current projections estimate a period of economic stagnation over the next several quarters, followed by a return to normalized growth trends. Consistent with the 2-year budget strategy presented during the adoption of the fiscal year 24 budget, this long-range financial forecast projects deficits in the near term. Revenue approved by voters last year for business tax and the gas equity transfer have been incorporated into the 10-year outlook, and expense projections are based on current approved service levels with estimated cost increases for salaries and benefits, contracts, and other non-salary expenditure categories. The uncertainty reserve that was established to fund shortfalls through fiscal year 2025 currently has about $10.1 million remaining to solve the fiscal year 25 deficit and fund items that were deferred as part of the fiscal year 24 adopted budget and return at mid-year. In addition, the BSR is still recommended at the 20% level to keep funding available for one-time needs. Based on current projections, major tax revenue is trending higher than budget, and a surplus of approximately $3.4 million is anticipated in fiscal year 2024. Expenses are currently tracking at budgeted levels, and staff will return as part of mid-year to review budget changes as needed as a result of projections for both revenues and expenses. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, the economy, particularly the local economy, continues to show strong performance with low unemployment and growth continuing. The chart on the lower left of this slide shows the national gross domestic product, or the GDP, back to 2020. This is a good indicator of the overall growth or shrinking of the economy. And although the latest quarter shows an increase compared to the previous 4 quarters, most projections indicate a return to lower GDP or stagnation over the next several quarters before returning to a growth period. The chart on the lower right shows the National Consumer Price Index, or CPI, back to 2021. This indicates the change in inflation over that period. As you can see, inflation has been very high over the past couple of years. It has come back down to about half of where it was last year, currently nationally about 3.2%. However, this is still higher than the Federal Reserve's target level of about 2% inflation. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights the base case forecast for 25 through 2034. The base case indicates that we're using revenue projections based on current information, expense information based on current approved service levels. The term base case is used to distinguish these numbers from the alternate scenarios that will be discussed a little later. Also, these numbers would be used as the base to start the building of the fiscal year 2025 budget. At the top of this slide, the table shows general fund revenues and expenditures by fiscal year, starting with fiscal year 23 actuals on the left, fiscal year 24 adopted numbers and current projections in the next 2 columns to the right, and the estimates for fiscal year 2025 through 2034 in the remaining columns. At a high level, expenses exceed revenues through fiscal year 2029. However, the gap between those two is shrinking each year. As shown at the bottom of the table, the one-time gap for fiscal year 25 is 0 when using the uncertainty reserve. However, this also means that any additional services or programs could cause the gap to grow in fiscal year 25 and beyond. Staff will continue to work with council to look at some one-time funding solutions to bridge these gaps, as well as continuing to revise revenue projections as more information becomes available.
So just one thing to try and hit home with this committee, this is, I think, an important slide and a continuation of your work you did back in May. So if you remember in May, when you were doing the proposed budget, you did essentially a 2-year budget. We knew that we were forecasting a deficit, and we set aside the funds, and this committee set aside the funds in order to support that deficit. So that's really what this is showing in 2025, is that yes, if you were to take pure revenue and expense forecasts, there would be a projected deficit. However, the council and at the guidance of this committee last year did set aside funding. And so what we would do and what we're planning to do based on council's direction already is to use that funding to solve that imbalance. So let me just pause here. Does that make sense in terms of what you did last spring to how that materializes in this 2025 column?
Do we use up the entirety of the uncertainty reserve, the 10.1?
That's a good memory on the number. We didn't use it up entirely. I want to say, Paul, do you know the rough estimate?
So the 10.1 is the amount that we have available. We started with 14. We used some of it to balance 24. So if we were looking here just as the numbers, we have about a $6 million deficit. So if you put the 10.1 towards that, you'd have about 4.1. And then any uses for mid-year items that were deferred would reduce that even more.
But given that the uncertainty reserve was only meant to be used in 2024 and 2025, then presumably there's a recommendation about what to do with the additional roughly 4.1. And does
Right.
that allow us to get some relief in 2026?
Sure. So of that 4.1, if you recall, 1 million of that was set aside specifically to be dealt at mid-year in 2024. So then that draws it down to you would have 3 million remaining in the uncertainty reserve. Now, to your question, can we use that $3 million to offset 2026 is, what is it, 5 million, I think, and make it 2? Absolutely. That's a policy call. And you know, that's one of those things that, as I think we move through and we tried to highlight in the staff report, the long range is intended to show if you aren't using one-time monies to solve things. And then obviously we do use these variances from estimates to adjust our financial picture on an annual basis. And those are the policy calls we move through as part of the budget process.
Well, and we also have this 3.4 million that we're projecting for this year
Mhm.
above what we were.
Correct.
So we had that remainder of the uncertainty reserve,
Yep.
which is now increased by 3.4, depending on what we
Yep.
do with that on the mid-year
Correct.
budget.
That's correct. Yep.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So this slide is detailing the major tax revenues. As a reminder, major tax revenues make up approximately 60% of the general fund resources, with property tax and sales tax being the two biggest contributors. Most of the tax revenue categories have returned to pre-pandemic levels as of the fiscal year 24 budget, with the exception of documentary transfer tax and the general fund transient occupancy tax, or TOT. Documentary transfer tax, or DTT, is a volatile revenue source and can fluctuate on an annual basis because it's dependent on sales volumes and mix of commercial and residential sales. Overall, TOT has returned to pre-pandemic levels. However, based on the council approved split of the TOT funding, more of it is projected now to go towards the capital infrastructure than towards the general fund piece. Currently, revenue from property tax, sales tax, and utility users tax are anticipated to exceed the budget in 2024. This is slightly offset by decreases in DTT and TOT coming in lower than budgeted. Also, the reduced TOT revenue in 2024 would cause a slightly reduced transfer to the capital fund. So the combination of these items is what brings you to that $3.4 million surplus that we're currently projecting in 2024. Additional information for revenues by category can be found on packet pages 10 and 11, and additional discussion in attachment C on page 31.
And just for reference, this table has not been adjusted for inflation. So if you were to adjust this for inflation, I don't think we could make the statement that all revenues are at pre-pandemic levels, just to make that clear for the public and council.
Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, and maybe we want to use the term pre-pandemic dollar amounts to help that clarification.
On the expense side of the forecast, costs for current service levels have been assumed with increases for salaries and benefits based on labor negotiations through the end of fiscal year 2025. A 2% annual increase is included for all employees starting in 2026 as a forecasting assumption, not as a commitment to future negotiations. A reserve has also been included for potential changes in future labor costs, including changes in vacancy rates, labor and benefit rate variability, and inflation assumptions. This budget also includes vacancy savings that are expected to materialize as positions are vacated and new employees are hired. As of the timing of this forecast, the vacancy rate is approximately 13.5% in the general fund. This excludes vacancies in the public safety departments. To better align with the status of vacancies, this forecast does increase the vacancy estimate from previously assumed rate of 3% up to 5% in all years of the forecast. Consistent with past practice, vacancy assumptions are lower than the actual vacancy rate to allow departmental use of those savings for other staffing strategies.
Can you comment a little bit on that trend since we last looked at the budget? We were struggling to settle on what we think would be a just modestly conservative vacancy rate, that we were seeing an improving trend. But we really didn't know how much. And so where are we compared to where those discussions left off in May, I think?
In terms of the rate, I'm not sure. I know that the adjustment that we've made here is that we typically use a 3% vacancy rate. We've upped that to 5% to get a little bit closer, but not kind of.
But we're at 13.5. And then, as you say, that doesn't mean that we have that 8.5% that is available, because a lot of that gets used to backfill from via overtime or outsourcing. But I'm still maybe after Paul finishes, if we can have a little more update on where are we compared to the assumptions we were struggling with when we adopted the budget recommendations in May on vacancies. And really on that expense side, because saw at the beginning it was noting that expenses are tracking according to budget, but this sounds to be still a higher vacancy rate than what we assumed when we did the budget.
I think to your point, let's have the broader discussion about that once the presentation's over.
Costs for large contracts that have been approved by council, such as the custodial contract and the landscaping contract, are in line with contract terms and then increased by a standard 4% CPI annually. Costs for other non-salary expenditures are also increased by a general 4% CPI, with these estimates being replaced as part of the budget process by actual requests from departments for increases that are needed. Additional information for expenses by category can be found on packet page 13, with additional discussion in attachment D on page 40. And then along with the expense estimates in the forecast, there are several assumptions that are not included. We typically refer to these as known unknowns. These are items that have potential future needs, but the total scope or cost have not been fully defined, or the council needs to basically give us authority to add those items in because they are above and beyond the service levels that are currently approved. These items are listed starting on page 15 of the memo. And I just wanted to highlight these limited term programs because these are something new that we haven't really had in here before, but these are programs that have funding for a certain amount of time within the forecast, but because we're trying to adhere to what council is currently approved, these programs will end unless additional resources are added. And the details for those are in the memo itself in terms of when they specifically end. I will now turn it over to Jessie Deschamps. She's going to discuss the alternative scenarios, the budget guidelines, the HISRAP funding referral, and then wrap up the presentation.
Thank you and good evening. Next slide, please. The next two slides in the presentation include the alternative scenarios to the base case. These alternatives were modeled separately to show the individual impacts. However, aspects of both could occur simultaneously in the future. So this first scenario here shows the impact of a 1% loss of economically sensitive revenue, which includes major taxes, charges for services, and permits and licenses. As compared to the base case, this scenario reduces overall revenues by 2.1 million in fiscal year 25 and increases the projected shortfalls through fiscal year 29. Similar to the base case, the forecast begins to show a surplus at fiscal year 30. Next slide, please. This scenario shows the impact of a 1% compensation adjustment in fiscal year 26. This is following the sunset of the current labor agreements. So as compared to the base case, the scenario increases overall expenses by 1.2 million in fiscal year 26, and similarly increases the projected shortfalls through fiscal year 29. The forecast does begin to show a surplus in fiscal year 30, though at lower levels than seen in the base case. Next slide. Attachment A of this report includes the fiscal year 25 budget development guidelines. These are brought forward each year to help in developing the upcoming budget. A few to highlight here are developing a structurally balanced budget that aligns ongoing revenues and expenses, examining appropriate uses of surplus funds, reviewing allocations for City Council identified priorities, exploring alternative service delivery to maximize the effective use of resources, expanding or adding new revenue sources, and continuing to proactively fund long-term liabilities. Next slide. Attachment E of this report includes a response to the City Council referral. This was to consider pegging HESREP allocations to a benchmark, such as % of general fund budget. So as part of this review, staff confirmed that previous allocations had not been approved to be tied to the general fund budget. Rather, allocations have been updated based on CPI or direct allocation as funding was available. Historically, funding has averaged 0.26% of the general fund budget for HISRAP. This percentage excludes projects that were previously funded through HISRAP and now have direct funding allocated, including Avenidas and the Palo Alto Community Childcare. So adjusting for these programs, that percentage increases to 0.83% for total human services funding. So for context, it would require an additional $800,000 annually to reach the equivalent of 1% of the general fund budget in the base case and forecast years. Next slide. So in summary, the forecast recognizes revenue trends that are consistent with economic stagnation, followed by growth. This forecast is consistent with the 2-year balancing strategy initiated in fiscal year 24. It invests in key priorities and urgent needs, recognizes that alternative scenarios may increase projected shortfalls, and identifies the uncertainty reserve and one-time surpluses as necessary to manage near-term fiscal stability and priority investments. Next steps in the budget process include a full review of the long-range financial forecast with the City Council in January, mid-year review in February, which will include additional investments in key resources, and review of objectives that were deferred by the City Council during the adoption of the fiscal year 24 budget. And then lastly, the fiscal year 25 proposed budget process will begin in May. Next slide. And this is the last slide of our presentation. It's a recommended action, which is to review and recommend that the City Council accept the long-range financial forecast and the budget development guidelines and direct staff to use this forecast as the starting point for the fiscal year 25 budget process. So with that, that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we see if we have any members of the public wish to speak at this time, and then we can go to questions and comments.
Chair, we have no request to speak.
That was easy. So colleagues, questions or comments?
I appreciated your question, Pat, about vacancy rate, and it strikes me as this really mercurial thing. We want to fill the positions because we need the city to move faster toward achieving its goals, and yet we achieve some savings when they aren't filled, and we spread that savings elsewhere. So it feels to me to be this sort of, I don't know, damned if you do, damned if you, no, it's like, we want it all. So I would like to begin by just following up on Pat's question and diving deeper into where we are with that. And how that vacancy rate as a projection is reflected in our revenue or savings on expenses. Like what are you
Sure.
projecting and how does it
Yeah.
impact? Okay.
I think, so a couple things. One, I think what staff is able to support in terms of a dialogue tonight will be unsatisfying to the committee. We don't have all of the details in terms of the numbers that I think you likely are looking for. So I think that is good for us to note that that's an area of follow-up. This will be brought forward as part of to the full council in January. But frankly, I think more importantly is as part of mid-year. That's helpful feedback for staff to make sure that we're prepared for a more thorough conversation on this topic. I think what we can accomplish tonight is talking about it at a macro level in terms of talking about the levers, the tension that you've identified, because I think that's a very real thing, and just kind of at a high level what the numbers are at. So as Paul identified, we have a vacancy rate in the general fund of I think about 13% right now. The FY 2013. The FY 2024 adopted budget, the year that we're in, budgetarily assumed about a 3% vacancy factor. That's consistent with prior year long ranges. And so what I think you're likely looking for is a projection of, with the volume of vacancies that we have, what is the gap? What's the gap between the 3% that's already factored into the budget versus what's actually materializing? And so that's something that I think that we can come back with more information on. We haven't issued our Q1 financial status forecast. We talked about that last week. We do expect that to come in January, I think, as an information item to the council, and that will inform mid-year, obviously, as well. And so let me just pause there in terms of, I think those are the variables that are at play, and likely the variances that the committee is interested in from a tracking perspective.
Can I just ask one clarification? You
Sure.
said that we assumed 3% in the budget. I had in my head that we had pushed you and gone to 5%.
You did in 2023.
Oh, okay.
You did in 2023. So in 2023, right, we said, and so this is where, and this is why staff didn't necessarily prepare for this discussion tonight, the tension between what we're operating in any given fiscal year in the 12 months that we're feeling today versus this long range forecast, which staff is really looking at. If I take some of that noise out, what does it look like in terms of our structural revenue and expense? Now, we obviously have variances every year. You have a commercial sale, your documentary transfer tax spikes. You have a lot of vacancies. You have vacancy savings that will materialize. And that's why you saw Paul highlight the $3.4 million above revenue estimates in the current year. And so that's why I say I think the long range is really trying to take out that noise so the committee and the council can take a step back from the day-to-day variances and look at where we're at to help make policy decisions from a financial planning perspective. And then obviously, as we engage in an annual budget process, the specific 2025 or the specific 2024 status, that's when these additional, so what's the real number kind of thing comes into play, and we can adjust and spend and allocate. Is that helpful?
Could I ask a follow-up? We've gotten the percentage, but I'd love to know the percentage of what. So I don't have a good sense of what percentage of the general fund is salary and benefits. So help me understand what that 13% is 13% of, so I can figure out what the 3% is and what the difference is.
So salary and benefits are about 60% of the general fund budget.
So 60% of 275,
Yes,
which is
off the top of my head, I don't know.
About 17. 16 something.
165.
Sorry.
165. Right, 60%.
so keep going. 60% of the general fund is salary and benefits,
Right,
about
so-
165 million. And you're saying we have a 13% vacancy in that, which is about
10%
10
difference from, so 116 and a half.
It's about 20.
About 20.
20. No, 13%.
Versus 3.
But we have 3 already. There's
Oh,
3 already in the budget,
So
so
it's
okay,
10.
got
It's
it.
just a
Sorry.
decimal point.
okay, all right.
No.
What are you? Did you like have extra coffee or something? Okay, fine. I'm the only one struggling with Greer. Okay, thank you. Okay, all right. Now, and I guess my question just finally is the $3.4 million estimate or projection of surplus in the current year, is that largely or entirely based on these vacancies, or are there other, okay, it's a portion.
it's revenue. Correct. It's primarily on the source side. So this is based on the most updated, I think, sales tax number. We got our most recent quarterly cash payment. We don't know that underlying economics.
So unless we do a whole lot of hiring, we're gonna have a bigger surplus.
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that because the council has a lot of initiatives underway, and that vacancy savings allows staff to adjust and take on those initiatives, and they'll move the savings around to accommodate the desires. So, you know, on any given Monday, the council may give, I'm going to pick on Jonathan because he's the usual suspect. But the council may give planning and development services additional guidance for another scenario or some more analysis on some planning ordinance. And Jonathan will pull his on-call contractors, and how he funds that is he will use the vacancy savings to fund those on-call contractors because he doesn't have the staff to do the work. So the savings doesn't actually materialize. So he'll take that referral on a given Monday, go to contractual service assistance, and spend those funds. So I think it is a dangerous thought to think that we'll have another 20 million in savings, but I think what the chair is asking is what is that number? And I think that's a conversation that we can have in the new year.
One thing I was surprised about was the transient occupancy tax and the return that we have seen, though now I want to better understand, is that return to use kind of Pat's new term here to pre-pandemic dollar amount, or okay, so our transient occupancy tax is back to pre-pandemic dollar amount. Nice. Well, that's surprising. I mean, I think my assumption was that we would see a lot of increase in telecommuting and reduction in just that return in business travel. Do we know what's leading that change? And if that's expected to continue and to grow, or
I'll just add, we have a good part of it is new supply. We have the 2 hotels on San Antonio, the President Hotel, and then the Cardinal coming back online. Those are the 4 that I'm aware of, and that's significant in terms of numbers of new rooms since before the pandemic. So the occupancy level and the average daily rate are still down. And I don't know if we have that information on the TOT revenues. We historically have often had ADR and occupancy levels, which helps us understand what's happening.
Yeah, if you look in attachment C, which talks about the revenues on page 34 at the top, it does talk about average daily rate and occupancy rate. So daily room rates declined from about 252 to 223. And occupancy rate also decreased from about 74% to down to 67%. This is as of August of this year.
And I'll just add that we never get close to 100% occupancy because in real strong periods, we'd get close to that 4 days a week. And then Friday through Sunday, it drops way off.
Right.
So even when we would see the average daily rate, as soon as you start approaching that 100%, those 4 days, the average daily rate goes up, and the increase in occupancy doesn't go up very much because the key 4 days, they're maxed out. Now, whether we get a little bit different scenario post-COVID, where we have extended stay being a more of a pattern, I don't think it's a drastic change, but we might see a little bit of a tweak there. But kind of watch that that occupancy level as it goes. I wouldn't expect. I'm frankly surprised that the average daily rate has recovered as well as it has. But I wouldn't expect a real upturn in the average daily rate until the occupancy level, those 4 days, starts getting close to 100%, over 90 or so.
Yeah, and I think it'd be kind of I know that we've had kind of conversations about this in the past, but is there ways to expand advertising tourist opportunities in Palo Alto to be able to increase our vacancy over the weekends? So one concern I have is, and I assume then staff will be bringing back kind of to place on the chopping block all of these temporary programs that are very, let's say that have been showing a lot of success, like PERT and Palo Alto Link and others. What's the process going to look like for that? Is that going to just be in kind of annual budget cycles? I think these are things that it'd be nice to be able to have a more long-term kind of view and strategy, and to be able to have staff kind of proactively working with the county and state to be able to seek grants and other opportunities and partnerships. Maybe a huge loss for us to lose PERT after all the work that we have put in to be able to create that program. Palo Alto Link, I think we were just discussing yesterday, probably one of the reasons why our perceptions around transportation has been so high this year is because of the success of that program, and that's addressing some of our SCAP goals. So I know I'm kind of like bringing up these things we struggled with the tier 2 funding about what do we let go, but just some of those, it'll be kind of like Sophie's Choice. I can't imagine cutting it.
Can I just add to that I think you look at this list and it feels like some of the sweetest things that we have going and that we offer and that people think of when they think of the city. I mean, starting with SCAP, and then something like grade separation, which is sort of this inevitable have to figure it out, massive infrastructure, to something tiny like PERT, or not PERT, but Link. I looked at this list and I was like, wow, all of these things we love, fleet electrification, they are not included in the forecast, and found myself thinking, well, what is included in the forecast then if these amazing things that we plan to do and are doing are not included? So to Greer's point, you know, how have these things been handled in the past?
Sure, I can help. So I think first things first, they are in the staff report and they've been highlighted to have this exact dialogue. So the forecast is intended to reflect the actions that council has already authorized, no more and no less. And that's intended to help the council the committee ultimately and council make informed decisions as you move through your business. Not only as you move through your annual budget process, but as you move through your decisions on any given Monday. because you are making financial decisions as you move through materials. You're talking about priorities, you're talking about projects. And so the intention of the long range forecast is to show the council and the committee where, if everything was to stay status quo based on your current authorizations, what does it look like? And it's intended to help inform the policy decisions that you make. So I don't think, or I should say, staff had no intention of putting these in here and showing them as these limited term to say they're on the chopping block and we're going to say, oh, we're cutting them, we're getting rid of them. But we did put them on there so that you as council members and a committee are aware that in order to continue these services, two things need to happen. One, an action to continue them from the council giving that guidance. But two, there's a financial impact of that. And so what does that do and how does that change and shape your, few years beyond, right? None of these decisions are, maybe one of them is in FY 2025, but I think a few of these are in the outer years. What I can reassure you is that staff does continue to look for grant opportunities, obviously, as we move through any of these. And so to the extent those materialize, we bring those forward. But from a planning perspective, unless we have that grant award in hand, we wouldn't put it in that forecast. So I think you're having the right discussion. And ultimately, these are areas that we'll need to keep an eye on in terms of funding priorities.
And I was saying, I don't know how we address this, but it's always kind of a struggle to, and probably, I mean, with our very large budget and we spend, we authorize so much spending every single week to kind of be able to keep track of, we approve this on consent. What does that mean for the budget moving forward for, possibly giving up these opportunities in the future? I don't know how we address that issue, but I guess that's what I'm kind of looking at as far as like a process goes moving forward to be able to I guess fully understand the implications of our decisions if it means giving up some of these type of programs.
If I might respond to that just quickly, Vice Mayor, that specifically since you reference approving things on consent, we would not be putting things on consent that were not consistent with the forecast and that had already received that type of direction, especially anything that has ongoing financial obligations. So that's to a large extent baked into the way that we move on your agendas. At the same time, as Kylie pointed out, what we have before you this evening really reflects and supports prudent financial planning and prudent financial decision making. But also, and I think you're touching on this, something of strategic decisions as well. So the classic example, and I'll say it because it's so common, is what are your assumptions on labor agreements and increases that will happen on a year-to-year basis? So do you assume a large percentage to give you room to work, or recognize that if you assume that large percentage is likely to come true? Same would be true with grants for things like Palo Alto Link, where, do we assume that we want to continue it, so we'll bake it into a forecast, and does that decrease our likelihood of getting grants from other bodies? So I think those are exactly the issues that can be on the bubble that lead to it's not a comfortable conversation, but it's one that helps inform your decisions as you take them down the road.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. One thing, and I'm sorry, I can't remember, the SUMC funding only goes through 2027 for what again? I lost that in my notes, and
It's for PERT.
Okay. Why does the SUMC funding end in 2027 for that? I don't recall.
I believe we run out of the funding. We use it up at that point, so there's no more left
Okay.
to cover that program.
Okay, thanks. And then kind of just continuing on sort of this kind of strategy and process question. I'm just curious kind of how we develop a process to discuss with council ongoing city priorities, kind of regarding all these assumptions that are not included in the forecast. And I'm kind of struggling because there's a long list of assumptions there, but I guess we don't have cost estimates for a lot of those programs. I mean, things like, the report mentioned SCAP and significant cost implications for that. So that's why I was kind of like struggling reading this, trying to develop, okay, how are we going to prioritize things? How are we going to make this strategy when we don't know what those cost estimates are? And I understand that staff wouldn't be expected to be able to have all those cost estimates at this point. So I mean, I guess I understand this is really more of an update and then an approval, but it's hard when it just seems like there's so little kind of concrete information, at least from my perspective. And I'm sure that's just the nature of this, but
Just weighed in on all that. I think gives us, there's a reality that we look at a long-range financial forecast and it's got this whole set of explicit numbers each year going out all those number of years. And there just needs to be a whole bunch of humility to reviewing that says it is not a certainty. And I will add that there are times, I think even in the report where it says this will happen. And I think we need to put qualifiers in that language because we just don't know those things. There's so many uncertainties on a variety of levels, and it's a critical tool, and we use it and as a reference point. But at the same time, every one of these can matter. In fact, one of the things would like us to do more, just so that we understand how things, we get times where we'll get we'll get a forecast and they almost invariably show long-term deficits. And like I remember a year or two ago, and council members were freaking out over it. And this one, I think, is showing less long-term deficits than we've had for several years. But that's the nature of the beast, and we just need to put those qualifiers in there and said, this is the best we're able to do, and there's all these variables, but nevertheless, you must do this, and it becomes the reference point from which we move.
and kind of just a follow-up to that. I mean, do we have just maybe historically what maybe like our kind of margin of error is within these projections as far as millions or thousands
Sure.
go?
I mean, any given year, the budget, as you can see, can swing millions, and different councils have had different fiscal policy choices that they've made. In fact, when we did the pandemic budget, we went so far as to provide the council with 3 forecasts and said, you choose which one you want us to plan for and based on fiscally, because inevitably, to the chair's point, there will be variability. These are forecasts. And so that variability is expected. So there was an audit done, actually, because the same question came up. I would need to go pull it to see what the audit said. But ultimately, the audit, we did have, I think the first year Baker Tilly had come on board as our external auditors. They did an audit of the forecast and the forecast process. And so ultimately, it identified some areas for additional detail, like looking at conferences for TOT rates and the like, but overall upheld the process, acknowledging that there is just some variability that you'll never be able to erase. Just one point I'd like to make from what the chair had said about this forecast is showing not necessarily 10 years of deficits. Yes, there are more aggressive estimates, I would say, in here. As you can see, we upped vacancy savings from 3 to 5, just because acknowledging where we're at as an organization. But I'd also like to, frankly, give credit where credit is due, which is to the organization. Current and past council members have worked really hard to have this forecast look like this for a 10-year period of time. Proactive pension funding, putting in supporting funding for infrastructure, the ballot measures, all of those are really hard policy decisions that over the last handful or so of years that this community and this organization has made to make a forecast look like this. So it's, just want to acknowledge that it doesn't just happen. There's been a lot of work that's gone into getting us where we are.
Great, thanks. And if you could find that, maybe not tonight, but sometime. Thanks.
Just another. So having been through just one round of this, the tier 2 process was very illuminating. And I remember feeling similarly to how I feel now, which is like a lot of the good stuff's in the tier 2, a lot of the good stuff's not included in the long range financial forecast. So my question is the tier 2 allocation, the money council, the finance committee is going to be told in subsequent years that we can play with and allocate, is that amount forecasted? Okay.
I would say it's not. I would say,
I mean, I guess I would say that the money that was added last year for tier 2 items is included in here because those programs are continuing. But a lot of the things that got deferred since they were not added, those are a lot of the things that are in the kind of known unknown list. And so if those were something that council wanted to add, we would need to make some decisions about, do you find additional funding for that? Do you reduce something else to fund that? Or do you use one-time money to sort of bridge it and hope that you can get to a point in time where your revenues do catch up to your expenses?
I'd also just encourage, as council members, and as staff, we often are looking at the newest initiative in front of us, and dealing with development of the policies, implementation of those programs and adjustments for them. What's in this $275 million general fund budget are also core things that we would be remiss if they were to go away. So I hear what you're saying, and it puts everybody in that kind of uncomfortable conversation of what's on the bubble, what comes in and what comes out. And we have 5 libraries funded in here with lots of hours that we've increased right back to pre-pandemic levels, which is wonderful. We've, moved towards electrifying our fleet, right? As we've in here, we've got all of our fire and EMT and ambulances back online from the prior kind of browned out states that some of them might have been in. So there are wonderful services that are still included in here. And we will always inevitably any year have this tension of what else can we add? And so I think we as staff can work on how we tee that up in terms of that conversation of what ends up on the bubble, what doesn't. But ultimately, I think no matter what, that's how a budget process is going to work, just like you do in your personal lives. What do I want to prioritize versus what am I going to just wait 6 more months and see if we have additional funds for? A good indicator, I think, in terms of funding is the one-time monies that we've already identified in this conversation. So we talked about there's probably about $3 million in the uncertainty reserve and maybe another $3 million in excess revenue, depending on the needs at mid-year. It's all coming from the same pot. So I think that's a really good indicator as to the amount of funds that the committee and the council will have to kind of play with in terms of one-time funding in the upcoming year. And the thing to remember is, how do you want to plan for 2026? Do you want to allocate some of these one-time funds to cover that 2026 forecasted deficit? Do you want to allocate them to projects or priorities? And those are the policy decisions that we're going to embark on as we move into the budget process.
One question I have is when we have this, like this year right now with about 3.4 million projected surplus revenue, and that came from certain revenue streams and 2 that actually dropped. Do we then adjust the base assumptions for going forward? Okay.
Yes, we do.
Okay, and I saw on the document transfer tax, that's one area that I saw the adjustment that what we have going forward. It's the most volatile revenue stream. I think that one is probably fairly conservative because even though in any given year it could dip below that line, it's lower than our average has been for a long while. On the other hand, there's some uncertainty on the commercial property tax going forward. Have you gotten any information from the assessor on that, or any thoughts on that? Or have we made any adjustments to be more conservative on our commercial property tax assumptions?
Sure. So our property tax consultant is through HDL Corn and Con, and they help inform the property tax estimates. And we don't have details from the county in terms of the actual adjustments they may or may not be making. However, they have advised us to basically be circumspect in the level of growth on the commercial side. And so that's been factored into based on our consultant's advice.
Yeah, because there could be some challenges to assessments going forward.
Correct.
And they wouldn't want, even if the assessor is expecting it, they wouldn't want to publicly acknowledge it and encourage it. That'll be interesting to follow.
I can say that we have seen an uptick in our property adjustments in our property tax, just like from a data perspective. For those that are curious, Prop 8 adjustments are where there's either been a challenge or the assessor has proactively gone through and reduced the assessed value based on market or challenges. So we are seeing an uptick in that. Nothing anywhere near like the Great Recession. But we are seeing growth as opposed to flat.
So an uptick in the number of downward
volume.
assessments.
Correct.
Yes, an increase in
Yeah.
those. Yeah. And then, okay. Then one thing that we don't budget for is grants that we don't have. But do we have any going back 5 or 10 years? Do we have an averaging of and that also fluctuates wildly year to year, but do we have an averaging of what are the unbudgeted, unprojected grants that we receive from a variety of sources? And over time, does that give us a little better sense based on the average, even though any given year we can't project it?
I can say we definitely don't have that number.
Okay, that might be a useful number. Not one that we would then use to build into the budget, but to be aware of and to think, okay, over 5 years, we'll probably be in this ballpark. In any given year, it could be below it or above it.
I think that would be information that staff should be able to pull together in preparation for the full council discussion. If my recollection is correct, we have ramped up our grantsmanship significantly over the last, say, maybe 4 or 5 years, or maybe even less than that. 3 years, three years or so. And that, it may tell a good story, but Chair would know very distinctly that the grants we've recently received for grade separations will make it look very spiky, so to speak, in the last year or so.
Yeah, and I guess we'll want to break those down between one-time capital project grants versus other programs. Yeah,
right. Yeah, that may be a little more difficult for us to distinguish, but perhaps we can find some way to categorize that.
This is not an insignificant part of the budget. Because it's something that we can't project on a grant by grant basis. We've never really incorporated it, but they do happen. Yeah.
Chair, the one thing just to remember on that is oftentimes we get grants and we appropriate the corresponding expense with it. So seldomly are we going to receive a grant for reimbursement of an existing expense or an existing program.
Yep.
Not saying it never happens.
No, that's right.
But just to acknowledge, if we do receive, you will likely see an equal increase in both revenue and expense once awarded.
Right. Although what we'll have on the capital side is we do have unfunded projects that they will then help us meet the funding on. Others are capital projects that we didn't put in the long range capital because we didn't have any dollars. Okay. On the budgeted uses of the business tax, we had 3 categories that we committed to the voters on. Restoration of public safety. That one's clear. We've already built that in. then transportation, and then affordable housing. And now a couple of the programs that we are saying we need to fund, basically, or one is the home, or I don't know, quite correct to say need fund, that are not currently funded. One's the home key ongoing past the first 5 years of operations. Is that the way we have it? 7. Thank you. And the Palo Alto Link. And then of course there's local share on grade separations, whether that be the vehicular ones or the bike and ped ones. So on the transportation and affordable housing, how have we built that approximately $6 million from those two categories combined into the projections? Where are they? Where are we planning on spending them as of right now? Or are we just categorically placing them?
So at the moment, the revenue for the transportation piece has been programmed to offset costs for those grade separation projects in the capital fund. So instead of using money transferred from the general fund, just general money, we're using the revenues coming in for the business tax for the transportation to offset costs in those projects.
Let me pause on that one and then we'll go on to the next. But I thought with what we've been able to negotiate with VTA, that we're being able to use Measure B dollars for all the design and next steps on grade separation. So I'm surprised that we're using the business tax at this point in time. Can you offer any explanation there?
So I'm not sure if maybe something has changed recently, but at least this is how we have programmed it up until this point, is to use that funding for those projects. If we have other funding that we can swap out for it, we can certainly use that. I just haven't heard that as a unavailable
well, that's
source.
In some ways positive to hear that that's how we've budgeted. When we just conceptually, when we were talking about it, we were saying, okay, 1/3 of the business tax, or about $3 million, would go to transportation. And we had talked, this isn't anything that was clearly established policy, that maybe 2/3 of that would go toward local share on the when we got into the real capital side and we needed more local share. Now, Measure B by the funding agencies is actually treated as a local share as well. And so we've kind of got two sources of local share. We don't know what portion of that capital we're going to, that eventual capital expense we're going to need to provide with local share. But with Measure B, as if they state and federal agencies and even NTC treats that as local share, that's a very strong local share compared to, say, what San Mateo County grade separations have done. When you look at the percentage of it that is a local share, it's a real minority. So I think it's one of the things we should be discussing is what portion of that 3 million should be set aside as a future, even bondable revenue stream for an additional local share, and what portion would be for other transportation projects or services, which could include Palo Alto Link. It could include other things, bike and ped things, transportation services. We won't decide that tonight, but I want to put that on the table for us to be thinking about. And I guess I'm kind of reassured that as of right now, we've just parked it as capital for the grade separations, which gives a little more latitude going forward. Okay, and then on the affordable house. Oh, Kylie,
Chair, I looked up the adopted budget, and to your question about Measure B funding.
Yeah.
In this past adopted budget, we actually started separating out the actual crossings. And that's where we started to identify, beyond the planning side of it, the Measure B funds coming into play. So, obviously those are further out and
But even
bigger
now with
projects.
the, I recall correctly, and city manager may remember more vividly, but I believe with what we negotiated, the three cities negotiated with VTA, we actually can use it now for the planning, whereas previously we could not.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Mhm.
So on the affordable housing, how have we used the business tax allocation?
So the affordable housing is the piece that we haven't fully allocated actually. And I guess just to remember, the business tax isn't fully coming in at that $3 million per piece until I believe 2027 or 2026.
Yeah, because remember, we phased in the rate. We did a 50% rate for calendar year 23, 50% for calendar year 24, and then calendar year 25 means the first year of the full
Right,
is
25
2027.
would be the first year. We get full.
Calendar year
calendar.
25.
Calendar, which goes half into
Correct.
fiscal. Okay.
Yes.
So yeah,
Okay.
just to keep that in mind that, so the way that we've been allocating the funding is allocating it for eligible expenses.
Okay, that's good too. So that means that we haven't spent it. It's budgeted but not allocated for a specific purpose, which is what I kind of was hoping was the case. That's great. Okay, and then one small, well, at first I wanted to go back to this question on the items that come by on consent calendar. I was glad to hear that they're not breaking the budget when they're coming in at above what was previously anticipated. But I need to understand that better because we have a lot of them have been coming in at higher than projected costs due to all the inflationary pressures. And if anybody thinks it's just us, I encourage you to join us at the BART Oversight Committee meeting. But could we get a little more explanation as to how that manages to be that they seem to be going up more than projected, but they're within the budget?
Well, so the trigger at which that would not be the case is when we would exceed appropriations. So that's where we would bring a specific action that would typically require 2/3 approval by the council. So that's really the bright line perhaps that would distinguish any action that can be accommodated within the existing budget and those that would require special additional funding.
So when you're developing the budget and in these various categories, you've got a budgeted amount. Are you within that projecting in many cases a cost that is above what was for a given contract, the prior cost or the officially projected? I'm
No.
trying to
Do you
understand how
wanna
that happens,
describe it? Sure.
that it's not breaking the budget more than it is.
Sure. So I think there's a few layers to this. In this forecast, Paul can talk about the CPI increases that are assumed in it. We have higher ones, obviously, because of inflation. What actually happens is then that's what's in this forecast. This forecast was developed in, let's say, October, November timeframe for this discussion. In January, what staff will do is look at the actual contract changes, make base adjustments in alignment with what those known contract changes are, and then otherwise relatively leave things flat. Now, what that means is to the discussion earlier, if a contract comes in above what's budgeted, there will end the appropriation that's available. A couple things happen. One, we as a team, the Office of Management and Budget, always looks to the department to say, can you absorb the extra cost with things like vacancy savings or other savings in your budget, so we don't need to increase the appropriation. Because if we don't need to, then let's not. If they're unable to absorb it within existing levels based on whatever the activity is, then we bring forward an amendment to the budget, which does require a 2/3 vote. On consent, we do put budget amendments on consent, but it's only when and if they're within the course of the normal business. So meaning they're not going to break the budget. There's a COLA or there's a something in the contract that we didn't anticipate. And so we need to true it up because we can't absorb it. What we would bring on action, a really good example, is the rental registry program, where there was actually discussion of staff. And that's an ongoing new cost, new priority. And so we put that on action so the council can have that discussion about this ongoing financial investment. You know, it's a program, but then there's the cost associated with the program, and get the direction from the council as part of that action item to have the discussion and dialogue about those resource ads. So we don't talk about new things, new resource ads, things that are going to materially change this forecast on consent. We talk about those as action items because they're typically policy changes.
So that's helpful. I think about, we have one colleague who repeatedly expresses deep concerns over the consent items exceeding what was previously in a contract or anticipated. And I don't know whether it would have any impact, but I think it is important for the council to understand what's happening in this kind of broader context of multiple consent items, and why that's not a reason to have real apprehension about what that's doing to the budget. So maybe when we have this forecast item coming forward, a deeper explanation of that would be maybe helpful. Yeah.
My follow-up on that, thank you for that, Chair. I was sort of struggling with this myself. I found myself curious to be reminded, what is the limit of the contract amount that can be brought forward on consent? It's a city manager limit of some kind. Is it 100?
There's not a specific quantitative.
There isn't.
figure.
Okay. So forget that. We pass the consent calendar fairly routinely, but I don't think we ever really know what in the aggregate in an annual cycle, how much of our city's expenditures are coming through on consent. And I feel like that would be a great number to understand, right? It feels like it's most, right? But when you think about it that way, it feels, that it's perhaps something that there ought to be greater scrutiny around.
Let me add to that these things that come forward on consent don't come out of the blue. They're part of the whole set of operations and the budget and their fulfillment of what we had adopted in a budget. And that's part of the operations side. And unless they have a red flag for some reason, they're part of carrying out the policies and the budgets that we have already approved. They're not exceptions to it. They may have variations in costs that this discussion has given me some better understanding and reassurance that collectively they're not having an unknown impact, especially when we're in this period of a lot of inflation, but they're not outside of the process.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So just to underline that, your procedures and protocols say that about the consent calendar. So they're on consent because they're routine business previously approved by council, for example, through the budget. So you're doing that in your budget process, and this is execution of those directions.
And that I mentioned early on an interest in just looking at how this long-term forecast compares to a series of years over time in that forecast. I think that's useful for the council to understand it in context. Even I think back just a couple of years ago, and we had a scarier long-term forecast, and I had colleagues who had been on the council a long time who were just freaked out over it. And I'm going, we solved these things. Same thing we just went through at VTA, that we started with a big long-term deficit, and we worked through it. And Caltrain, and this is part of an kind of an underappreciated part of the process. It's what will happen if you don't do anything. Okay. Greer brought up on the TOT, we had this marketing program that first the city engaged on, and then that Visitors Bureau, it was essentially initially the San Mateo County Visitors Bureau, and then they ended up rebranding themselves, I think, as Silicon Valley one. And there was, my memory is that there was generally positive response from the hotel community in those early years, but the Visitors Bureau had other their other clients were not city governments. They were other forget what they call them, visitor agencies that that hired and engaged them, that are often done regionally and things. And we were a pain because we were looking for a whole bunch of accountability and reporting that was beyond their normal requirements or expectations placed on them. And it was kind of a question of whether it was worth it to them to continue with us as their one governmental client. And then, so the hotel association, or what I forget what we called it, but the group of hotels in town said, we'll take it on because we think it's a winner. And they did for a number of years. Until then, a few years ago, there were a couple of strong voices in the chamber who said, oh no, we don't think this is a good approach, and we want to end it, but the chamber will take it on. And this is my memory, and I'd like to revisit this and confirm kind of the history on this. And what's happened since then is we really don't have that function occurring like it did for, I don't know how many years, 6 or 8 years that we had this other agency doing it. And I thought it was a mistake to abandon them at the time. And I think it's worth revisiting. Now, on the other hand, it's not actually, it shifted so that it wasn't the city who was directly engaging after those first few years. And so there's kind of a dilemma of, well, how do we get that resurrected? Part of it might be that when we looked at the business tax, we said the business tax is not only needed and important for the community, it will benefit the business community. And there are a couple ways that it doesn't mean that all those dollars have to go to them. Indirectly, they benefit from transportation improvements. They benefit from public safety. They benefit from affordable housing. But more directly, there are a couple areas that we as a city might want to show valuable reinvestment in the business community in return for the tax that they are now paying annually that they didn't before. And two of those that come to mind, one is actually I neglected under the transportation discussion, which is our Palo Alto Transportation Management Association, our PATMA, and the ability to expand that to serving greater portions of the business community. And it basically was supplying transit passes for modest and lower income employees is the way it's evolved. In the first years of PATMA, I thought it was a lot of expense and not a lot of return. Now they've really tightened their belt in the last under COVID, and I think we're getting high value for a modest expense. Now, originally the business community said, oh, kick off the TMA, and in a few years we'll take over the funding and get grants. That didn't work out. Funding's predominantly coming from the city. But I think that expansion of the PATMA could be something that would be, as we're looking at economic development, we heard this last year, something that we hadn't understood previously, which is the businesses, the small businesses who didn't have their own TDM programs have said, this has been a huge impact on employee retention, which is a big challenge for those service industries. So that's one thing that under this category of how we would use the business tax in transportation, that has great benefits because it's driving transit use. I think it's something that we might want to look at, an investment in that that's a return to the business community, but has great benefits to the community as a whole, and it has economic development benefits in this difficult time for businesses that have to attract and retain modest income employees. And the other thing might be whether we would propose to the hotel community that we would make a contribution to this visitors bureau, even if they then managed the oversight of it. So we get out of that role that the visitors bureau said was just not worthwhile to it, of having to account to the local government for all the expectations we had on accountability, but it is an investment that we would make through that, if that's a legal approach that we could take. And it would be a contribution to get that kick started, and it would be a public-private partnership on getting that back activated again. So we'd help kickstart it. So I don't know whether those two things resonate with my colleagues and whether we want to ask staff to explore each of them.
Yeah.
It was easy. Does staff have any thoughts on that initially?
Well, I'm just thinking about it in terms of context, whether it be with the forecast or something that we engage as part of your mid-year budget discussion. I think it may actually fit better with the latter, but
yeah, that sounds right for me too.
Okay.
Yeah, if we could have any work on it before then, and we'll see whether it's still too early or who knows what, but at least begin that discussion.
sure.
Okay. I will also note, just on terms of projections going forward, we have the national kind of business environment, and then Silicon Valley has historically had its own business swings, and sometimes they align with the national pattern. Sometimes they're disconnected from the national pattern, it looks like we all, both nationally, especially nationally, that we may escape from a recession. We have a mild recession in the tech economy. Some people say, oh, this is really terrible, but as somebody who went through 35 years of this is a mild one so far. And we'll see whether we're kind of at the bottom of it and it starts a next phase of recovery. And in each tech recovery, the prognosticators say, yeah, but the last one's always had a next big thing that drove the tech economy. And typically at the time they say that, and we say, we don't see any next big thing. Well, the trick is that if you knew what the next big thing was, you would have invested all your money in it. But it's only really visible in hindsight. And whether AI is now being recognized as that, and people have invested in that a few years ago, or the ones who will do well, remains to be seen. But as of right now, it doesn't look like we're going to have a severe tech downturn. It's been more of really a correction from a bubble that occurred in a lot of the tech sector during COVID, ironically. Instead of a downturn that initially we thought was going to happen in COVID, the opposite happened. Once again, it's, if you had a crystal ball, you'd be really rich. Okay. I think that covers all of my items. Julie?
I have another, if I may. Thank you. The unfunded pension liability, of course, is a subject of consideration with the long-range financial forecast. And it's pretty exciting to see that our past council practices to, come up with our own normal cost and fund the Section 115 pension trust fund seem to have yielded, as far as this projection goes, that we will achieve the 90% pay down 2 years sooner. If I read that correctly, it was projected at 2036, and now it's projected that we'll be at 90% at 2034. So given that this long range financial forecast, am I right about that? I'm seeing some people like, well, not really. I'm pretty sure it.
Probably, I don't remember the exact years. I'd need Jesse to confirm. but-
Okay, let's assume,
Yeah.
for the sake of argument, that I'm correct on that. This long range financial forecast goes through 2034. So I find myself with bated breath, curious about 2035 and how the finances, like 90%, what do we, when we get to 90%, what does that mean we're going to do differently?
No, I think it's just because I don't think the answer is very exciting. I think the answer is we just keep on keeping on. These measures we're doing are to help ensure we don't have a spike, or we don't have, in a long range forecast like this, the volatility on an annual basis of the retirement contributions kind of yo-yoing, and 1 year all of a sudden they're millions of dollars more.
There must be some sense as to what 90% gets us, though.
Yeah, doesn't it, at that point in time, we have actually a decline in what we would need to invest in paying down the unfunded pension liabilities. That's a long ways out.
Yeah.
And a lot of things could happen between now and then. But we set this up actually initially on our, we don't talk about
I
it
see
because it
what
was
you're
even
saying.
before then, on the unfunded medical liability, which is what the council did even a decade before
Mhm.
we did the pension
Mhm.
unfunded. We stopped talking about that. We really should remind people that we are continuing to do that. It's in the budget, but people just kind of go, oh, whatever.
Yeah, so the council and the committee have done a few things. We expanded the pension funding policy to be a long-term liability policy. So now it encompasses both OPEB, so other post-employment benefits, the retiree medical, as well as our pension pre-funding, or proactive funding, I should say. In terms of the 90% funding, yes, in theory, you don't have this massive like mortgage payment that you're paying. I guess for me, the reason why I say it's status quo is because that's already included in all the forecasts. So when you're looking at kind of what are when CalPERS gives us our rates and looks at kind of what your contribution level is going to be, for those that have looked out beyond kind of the 20-year time frame, you actually see it drop down. And so you see your rates start to decline. And so that's already included in those kind of 30-year forecasts. You won't see something different than that. But yes, you in theory should see yourself move to a more normal cost level.
But since we're only looking here at our long range to 10 years,
Right.
we're not seeing that drop. And
Correct.
I think we think and hope that when we get to that point, it will be that more dollars will be available for capital investment and services as opposed to the pensions. And I'll just say that, also what happened was our reforms on pension formulas that happened in the 2009 to 12 period. And then the state's reforms that went even beyond ours. That's why we have 3 different pension tiers. That before that, local government was looking at a real fiscal cliff. It was unsustainable. And if those changes hadn't happened, we'd all be slashing services.
Yeah.
And so those were necessary and prudent measures that in another 10 or 20 years, we'll actually see that we're not only sounder, but we will have some dollars that should be available for other purposes.
And the reason I'm raising it, just looking at packet page 44 is where I got it. It does say, as part of policy goals, city seeks to reach 90% by FY 2036. In your every 4-year conversation that just happened, with consulting with an actuary, it looks as if the projection is 2034 for miscellaneous plan and 3637 for the safety plan. And then it says, semicolon, the city's practice of transmitting excess one-time savings will help reach these goals sooner. And we do have that practice. And so it does imply that within the context of this 10-year long-range plan, we will find ourselves having done this tremendous work potentially quite well. And you've said you've already projected it, but I guess we don't have to go into it now.
Oh,
but-
and you're right on that additional point. So that projection does not factor in accelerating that process by having essentially budget surpluses at the end of the year that are divided between allocating to capital and allocating to this. And it's our base section 115 and our base on the normal expenditure. So that's right, that we in all likelihood will beat that date.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
And yeah. Okay. Sounds like we've beat this one to death.
His rep
Okay,
was in there. We want to.
sure, go ahead.
Hi, Greer. I know you're a fan of his rep, as we all are. I don't know. I just saw it at the end and there was, we were trying to figure out if we needed to allocate more to his rep. And now we have a nice table that in a very complex way presents a set of percentages as to what his rep has reflected in terms of a percentage of the general fund when Avenidas and something else was a part of it and wasn't. And I just wanted to pick up that thread of, do we want to try to allocate more to his rep? Do we want to peg it to some percentage of the general fund, or have we been persuaded by this report that that is a fool's errand?
Yeah, I was struggling looking at the memo on that. I mean, it's nice to see the consistency we have of being really kind of around that, at least looking forward at like the 31% marker. And it's a significant jump if we want to go to 1%, and I'm just kind of concerned given the projections moving forward. But I am still interested in a policy that would peg it to a percentage of the general fund. But this memo didn't make me very happy. So I'm struggling. So it's a struggle. I think you're feeling the same way.
So
I guess the math is easy.
Mhm.
What's 0.8 million if we were to go up to 1%? So if we wanted to go up to like 0.5%, be an additional 0.4 million. Is that?
I'm sorry, I think that's to get to 1%. It's 0.8 million.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if we wanted to go up to like a 0.5%,
Not a
0.4 million.
0.5%, a half of the difference between what we are currently funding and 1% funding. So it's a fraction of a percent increase. It's not. So we already have the baseline. Is this based upon the difference between 0.83% and 1% is the 0.8? Is that what that is? No.
So it's based on, so if you look on the table for fiscal year 2025, what we are projecting for total human services funding is about 2.1 million. In order to get to 1% of the $282 million budget, you would need to add about 8.8 million to that. So your total human services funding would be at about $2.9 million.
So 25 is 2078, and
Correct.
that's 0.74%. So to get from 0.74% to 1% requires another 0.8 million.
Correct.
So it's basically an increase of 0.25% of the budget.
Well,
It
that's
would
looking
be-
at the 0.74 is total human services funding. That includes Avenidas and PAC.
Correct.
So we're just talking about, but that's not included in his rep anymore. So I was looking at the 0.31% if we wanted to
Okay.
increase his
So
rep
that-
to a
then
0.5%
To 0.5%
Yeah.
of the budget?
of the budget.
I see.
As just kind of like maybe a compromise that allows us to move the needle in a meaningful way, but doesn't break the
So
budget.
that would be then what about 600,000 or so per year? Additional funding for his rep? To go to 0.5% of budget? Ballpark? Assuming that's the case, then let's just kind of talk about that. I think that's something now that we've got a good analysis there that would be a policy discussion for the council and prospectively a referral from this committee. How about this? What do we have on the January agenda, and whether we might put this as a deeper discussion of that? Do we have a January Finance Committee agenda? We don't even typically meet, but if we do go forward with the policy change that would allow a carryover of existing committee compositions until new committees are appointed, we could have a meeting in January if we want to have a deeper discussion on this, so that we could, I don't know that we'd make a referral for mid-year anyway, so maybe it doesn't have to be that soon. If it would be a recommendation for the FY25 budget, we'd want to be able to have that discussion early enough so that staff would take that input into their planning for the budget.
Sure.
Ed, any thoughts on that process?
A couple of things. The natural point would be to make a recommendation, obviously, at the committee, but then bring that forward to the full council when you talk about the long range. So the staff, or I'm sorry, the council can understand this policy decision in the context of the ongoing impacts. I don't think there's any way we can meet that timeline, acknowledging when this is going to go to council, which is in January. That being said, if a committee were to review something like this in the month of February and then get council formal direction by early March, I would say that's the first meeting in March, frankly. That's the absolute last date in which we'd be able to matriculate that into the budget. Let me just pause for a second and help the committee understand that in 2016, this was discussed. And we actually went through and read the transcript and watched the video to really understand the discussion that happened at that time. And it feels really good to be able to identify a number and earmark it towards something. It ties your hands in your planning on an annual basis in ways that you may not anticipate until it's too late. And so I think a deeper discussion is fine. One thing I just want to float for the committee as you think about this, and as we think about it with council, is policies such as when we are reviewing surpluses, that his rep is one of the areas that we look at allocation of it when we're looking at a 2-year. And that provides flexibility, just like we talked about in the year end when there's excess BSR, 50% goes to the 115, 50% goes to capital. When you're thinking about how do you allocate funds, there was very lively discussion in 2016 and strong opposition, frankly, to a policy that dedicated a flat number.
Let me add though that we use what's the number before this last year where we gave a supplemental his rep funding. We've had an annual number that went to HRC. And was that number even adjusted for inflation?
We adjust it for inflation every year.
So we already have a set number.
Understood. But to make it a policy that it's going to be a percentage of the general fund. Your general fund can change on any given year because of one-time monies, reappropriations, grants. So to make a broad sweeping policy about a percentage can have implications. And then at some point you get into a labor intensive activity of like, okay, well, I want to normalize for these blips and that blip and adjusting.
Well,
so I guess share the prior conversation that happened with the committee.
Given that we need to have a deeper discussion, I will say that whether it should be this 1% or the 0.5% for his rep or whatever it might be, there's also an argument that there needs to be some continuity in a lot of this funding. And if we want to increase it, then we're back to having something approaching a fixed percentage. And maybe that's not the exact right way, but we don't vary our HISRIP funding typically year to year. Other than we pushed for an increase this last year. That as of now is on a one-time basis.
So the reason I wanted to raise it is I know we as a committee have talked about his rep, and we did manage to really bring more dollars forward. The council did this year. And I appreciate that this chart is giving us this tremendous history and that you watched the tape and it was agonizing. I do think that Avenidas and PAC are in very different circumstances than all of the other things that come under his rep. All of the other things that come under his rep are not being funded at the level they ask to be. We don't yet have enough dollars to do that. And it's not saying everyone should be funded at 100%. But Avenidas and PAC, I think, typically get what they're asking for. Maybe that's not true. They are very different things. Two large organizations and then a whole bunch of people getting a lot less money. So I appreciate having the history, how they were once aggregated and now we fund them separately, and it's great to see the percentages. But if you look at where we are now, approximately 30% of the general fund budget, 0.3% of the general fund budget is going to his rep. And in the past, way back in the day, it was 0.36, 0.34, 0.35. So we have had a diminution. And I think what I love about finance work, and I don't think of myself as a finance person, and I enjoy being on this committee, the numbers tell a story. And I think you're talking about the dangers of pegging his rep to the general fund, but there's a completely different frame of that, which is that a city would commit that no matter what, with some exceptions, that those who have the least and are funded by his rep are going to always have a place in the budget. We're going to make sure that as we expand and contract overall, that his rep floats with that. It's a way to indicate how much it matters. You could argue it either way, but I feel that, the suggestion is we should talk about it further, and I would love to see that happen. And so I would be in support of that.
Yeah, and I'd just argue along the same line that without fixing a percentage, we've seen what happened of a decline in that funding over time. So I think from the standpoint of the commitment that this community makes to those most in need, I think there's an important policy decision that would be reflected in a budget that doesn't allow that is at what we think is a more appropriate level, that we would decide what's affordable and appropriate, some balance between those things, and it doesn't slip away over time.
So then this is just a referral back to this committee to discuss it then. And it doesn't seem like it needs to come in January, since that's.
No, but we can include in the report out on the long range forecast that this was something that the committee's going to consider. It's in the context of a long range forecast, but that we didn't yet go into that deep dive, and we intend to. And there's no sense we're not yet taking an action. It's just FYI to the council that we hope to make a recommendation of some sort.
Yeah, I think it's a continued referral.
Yeah,
perfect. And I agree with everything that Pat and Julie have said. I've always been a believer that we just get such an incredible return in our investment on this, and by investing more, we're going to get more services that the city is not having to pay 100% for. That these nonprofits are, most of their fundraising is not coming from the city; it's coming from other sources. So I think it's a wise investment. But glad we're going to have that deeper discussion.
Okay. On that note, I think we're ready for a motion.
I move the staff recommendation. Do I have to add this about the referral back to the committee? No,
I think it's already on the agenda. We'll just basically continue.
Okay. Second.
All right. Any further discussion? Clerk, please call the roll.
Vice Mayor Snow,
Yes.
Chair Burt,
Yes.
Councilmember Lifcott Haynes.
Yes.
The motion carries.
Okay, surprise. All right, so then we have our final item, which is an informational item on the calendar year 2023 Finance Committee referral status.
Staff doesn't have a presentation on this. You can come up, obviously. You're welcome to come up. We don't have a presentation and we're just here for questions. Ultimately, this is an annual report that we provide the committee on a status of outstanding referrals. Many are complete, some are in progress or pending future actions. And so all of that is described. And I think the one edit would be the last one, which is the 1% on his rep instead of complete. If I had a magic electric eraser, I would update it for to be continued in February.
Any questions on the referral report?
Just a question to kind of was that a typo that because that was my one question was that a typo that being complete and it was intended to be in progress?
No, in the sense that staff brought the conversation back to the committee.
Okay, so
We
that's
brought
the
it-
standard on this chart is kind of staff's to do, not necessarily the committee making a final decision.
Usually it's the committee makes a final decision. So we probably should have been a little bit clearer to say pending council or the committee's recommendation.
Sounds good.
Mhm.
And I wanted to thank you bringing back that is rep work and everything else.
And just the status on the JMZ, not just, is this, there's a related issue of the ticketing process as well as the pricing. And so the status on that is what again?
Sure. CSD has a consultant under contract that's been actively doing interviews of internal stakeholders and I think just stakeholders in general for JMZ. And we're expected to have that report in the new calendar year. That will help us understand these areas, and we'll then bring that back for the committee's review once we have it.
Is that more on the pricing though? There's a ticketing process that I thought was actually was actually going forward. Is that right?
We did provide new funding for a new ticketing system.
Yeah.
So I know they're working on that. I would have to find out from them in terms of if they've done that procurement or not.
Okay.
To lock down and what the implementation timeline
I know
is.
that that's a great concern because they think that is really hindering the whole museum operation.
Understood.
Yeah, okay.
We'll check with Kristen on that.
Okay. All right. Anything else? That concludes item number 2. And then we don't have a January meeting schedule. We're now talking about this his rep funding potentially being in February. That would still give staff time. Anything else on the agenda for February tentatively?
Typically in February, we look at potentially preliminary rate forecasts on the utilities to have an early discussion about that. I know the utilities team is underway working on those, but it will depend on the timing with the UAC review as well.
Okay. Great.
And the weather. That is an accurate statement. We skipped this step last year because of the
Depends on
weather.
which way the wind blows.
That's right.
Yep. Okay.
This is our last meeting.
Yep. Thank you all. Meeting's adjourned.
Thank you for running an excellent set of meetings this year, Chair.
Thank you.
Seriously, it has been a pleasure, and staff for doing such a tremendous job with the reports. Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks,
All
everyone.
right. Thanks.